Dad, we just want what's best for you. The court needs to know you're not fully capable anymore." The words hit harder than any fall I've ever taken. My hand trembled. The coffee cup clinked against the saucer, spilling a thin brown line across the morning paper. The smell of burnt toast lingered in the air, and for a moment, even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. I am Edward Collins, 72 years old, a retired piano teacher who once believed that love, especially the kind between a parent and child, could weather any storm. My wife Margaret used to say our family was our proudest symphony, but she's been gone 3 years now, and without her, every note feels off-key. Now, sitting across from my daughter, Laura, and her husband, Michael, I can't help but wonder when the melody changed. They speak gently, as if I'm fragile glass. Yet beneath that softness, I sense something sharp, something rehearsed. How did I end up here, being told I might not be fit to manage my own life? Was it the forgetfulness that comes with age, or something more sinister dressed up as concern? If you stay with me till the end of this story, I promise you'll see just how far love can bend before it breaks, and how easily trust can turn into a weapon. Some people call this kind of tale a family drama. I call it the day my world quietly split in two. Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. The kitchen that morning smelled of cinnamon and betrayal. Laura's eyes were wet but unwavering. Michael kept stirring his coffee, though the spoon never touched his lips. "You think I've lost my mind?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Laura shook her head. "No, Dad, we just want to protect you." "From what?" I leaned forward. "From myself?" The silence after that was louder than any argument. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and I realized it wasn't just my morning that had shattered. It was the quiet certainty that my family would never turn against me. When the ones you love most begin to doubt your sanity, what truth can you still hold on to? The hum of the ceiling fan mixed with the soft jazz playing from a corner speaker. The lobby of Maple Trust Bank smelled faintly of lemon polish and something colder. Formality, maybe. I stood in line, gripping my worn leather folder, the one Margaret had given me on our 25th anniversary. She always said, "Keep your papers close, Eddie. They tell the story others might try to rewrite." When it was my turn, the teller smiled politely. She looked barely 30. Her name tag read, Sophie. "How can I help you today, sir?" "I'd like to review the withdrawals on my account," I said, sliding my ID across the counter. "Something's off," she typed quickly, her eyes flickering over the screen. I see several large withdrawals, about $48,000 over the last 6 months." My breath caught. "48,000?" I repeated, the number heavy in my mouth. "That's impossible." She frowned slightly, then printed a statement and circled a line near the bottom. "All withdrawals were authorized by your caregiver, Mrs. Laura Bennett." The sound of her voice blurred. My daughter's name, next to that word, caregiver. I leaned closer. "Caregiver?" I managed to say. "That's my daughter." Sophie hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir. The form was legally approved. It's all in order." For a long moment, I couldn't move. The people behind me shifted impatiently, the sound of footsteps and muffled conversation pressing in like waves. I forced a small nod, took the paper, and stepped aside. Outside, the air felt thinner. I sat on a bench beneath a maple tree whose leaves were already turning amber. $48,000. Gone. Signed away under my own name, yet without my hand. I thought of Laura, how she used to sit on my shoulders at the county fair, cotton candy in her tiny hands. How did that same little girl grow into someone I couldn't recognize? A breeze passed, scattering a few dry leaves across my shoes. I picked one up, brittle and veined, and turned it in my palm. Maybe this is what happens when trust is handled too roughly. It crumbles at the edges until it's just dust pretending to hold its shape. When someone else holds your papers, your accounts, your name, who really owns your life anymore? They said I was getting old. They said I was forgetting things. But as I stared at the fading sunlight, I realized something I hadn't felt in months. I had never seen my mind so clear. Michael's office smelled of leather and expensive ink. The blinds were half closed, slicing the sunlight into careful, deliberate lines across the desk. He stood behind it, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, looking every bit the confident attorney he'd always wanted to be. For a moment, I almost felt proud. Almost. "I just need to understand why this was filed," I said, laying the stack of papers between us. My voice was steady, though my heart felt like it was walking a tightrope. Michael adjusted his glasses, avoiding my eyes. "It's just a formality, Ed. The court prefers to see everything in writing." I let out a quiet laugh. "In writing? Like my life, you mean?" He didn't answer. Just drummed his fingers on the desk, the rhythm quick, impatient. There was a time when I taught him how to read contracts, back when he was dating Laura, unsure of every line and clause. I used to tell him, "The devil hides in the fine print, son. Read it twice before you sign." Now here I was, watching him use those same lessons against me. "Michael," I said softly, "you know I'm still capable of managing my affairs." He sighed, folding his hands. "Ed, it's not about capability. It's about protection. Laura worries. We all do." I studied his face, the polished calm, the calculated tone. He was performing a role, one that fit too easily. "Protection," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "Or control?" He flinched, just barely. "You're reading too much into this." "I taught you to read, didn't I?" I said, my voice sharpening. "Maybe that's my mistake." For the first time, his composure cracked. He leaned forward, his tone lower, harder. "Look, Ed, it's done. Let's not make this ugly." Ugly. That word lingered, echoing through the room. How easily we use it to mask the truth, to name what we're afraid to admit, betrayal dressed as love. I gathered the papers, one by one, my fingers trembling less with age and more with anger. Each page was another nail in the box they were building around me. Guardianship, they called it. Protection, safety. But I knew better. This wasn't safety. This was a cage written in legal ink. I stood, taking one last look at the man across from me. The boy I once believed would honor my daughter and protect our family. Funny how the circle turns. As I reached the door, he said quietly, "You're not making this easy." Without looking back, I replied, "I made it too easy for too long." Out in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed like insects. I thought of Margaret, her steady hands signing the mortgage papers, the trust deeds, the letters. She would have seen through this long before I did. It's strange, isn't it? We spend a lifetime teaching others to be strong, and one day we wake up realizing they've learned how to use that strength against us. That's the cruel genius of deceit. It never knocks. It learns your voice and walks right in. I stepped outside, into the autumn wind, the city humming beneath a sky that had already begun to fade. It wasn't old age that made me weak. It was misplaced trust. The afternoon light slanted across the backyard, turning the old fence into a line of gold and shadow. I was trimming the dry hedges when I heard the familiar creak of the gate. Mr. Harris stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes sharp behind his thick glasses. "Afternoon, Ed," he said, voice like Charles gravel rolled in honey. "Mind if I step in?" I nodded. "You never needed an invitation, Harris." He chuckled dryly. "At my age, I like to make sure I'm still welcome before crossing into someone else's property." We sat on the old bench Margaret loved, the one that leaned slightly to the left, like it was tired of keeping balance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Just the rustle of dry leaves and the distant bark of a dog that hated the world. Then he sighed. "Ed, I came because I heard something you need to know. The guardianship case. It's already been filed. Not just drafted. Filed and scheduled." I froze. The pruning shears slipped from my hand, landing in the dirt. "You're sure?" Harris nodded, his jaw tightening. "If they win, you'll lose access to every cent you own." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "They're my children, Harris." He looked at me long and hard. Then pray they remember that before the verdict. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere down the block. For a heartbeat, I was back in that burning house. The roar, the heat, Laura's voice shouting for help. Or was it something else she shouted for? Hard to tell now. I looked at Harris. You've seen this before, haven't you? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Yeah, he said finally. A case 15 years ago. Man about your age. His kids convinced the court he was unfit. Said it was for his safety. He ended up in a care home, sold the house, the car, everything. Died 2 years later, broke but well protected. He gave a short, humorless smile. A real touching story of family values, if you like that kind of family drama. I couldn't help it. I laughed. A weak, dry sound that caught somewhere between disbelief and pity. Harris joined in, and for a second we looked like two old fools laughing at a bad joke the world kept telling. Then the laughter faded, leaving only the sound of wind between the fence boards. Maybe I should have seen this coming, I murmured. I raised them to be careful, to think ahead. Maybe they took that too literally. Harris stood, brushing off his coat. You've still got time, Ed. Go through your papers. Everything you ever signed, every trust, every transfer. They're counting on you not to. He started toward the gate, then stopped and looked back. Trust is a fine thing, he said softly, but it's fragile. You drop it once, and no matter how carefully you pick it up, it's never quite the same. After he left, I sat there alone, staring at the crooked fence. The sky was dimming, the air colder. Somewhere, a light flickered on in Michael's kitchen window across the yard. Trust, I whispered, though not in prayer. Once it hits the ground, can it ever be whole again? Rain fell in slow, deliberate strokes against the windows, like someone tapping to be let in. The house felt heavier on nights like that, full of echoes and sighs that belonged to someone who'd left too long ago. I wandered through the living room, dusting the old piano, the one Margaret loved more than her own wedding ring. The lid creaked when I lifted it. A few forgotten notes trembled out, fragile as memory. I smiled despite myself. Margaret could never stand dust on her keys. She said music was a kind of prayer, and prayers deserved respect. As I wiped the inside edge of the keyboard, my cloth snagged on something. I leaned closer. There, tucked beneath the frame near the pedals, was a thin, leather-bound book. Brown, cracked at the spine, smelling faintly of cedar and thyme. I turned it over in my hands. On the cover, faint gold letters read, 1985. When I opened it, old paper whispered like it was exhaling. Inside were neat, slanted notes in Margaret's handwriting, columns of numbers, account codes, transfers, a few underlined dates. At first it looked like a ledger. Then one line caught my eye. Account number 4721, Maple Trust Holdings, 4,200,000. I blinked, $4.2 million. I read it again, thinking perhaps my tired eyes had rearranged the digits. But no. It was there, written in Margaret's calm, patient hand. And at the very end, a note, short, gentle, as if she had written it knowing I would find it long after she was gone. For Edward, if you ever feel lost, follow the numbers. They will lead you home. I sat down on the piano bench, the journal resting open on my lap. The rain had turned heavier, the thunder rolling somewhere far away. My fingers brushed the ink, faded but steady. Are you still talking to me, Maggie? I whispered. Through all this? Through them? For a long moment I waited for silence to answer. But something inside me stirred, a pulse of warmth that hadn't visited in months. Margaret never did anything without a reason. If she left this, it wasn't for nostalgia. It was a map. The piano groaned softly as I closed the lid. The journal felt alive in my hands, humming with quiet intent. Somewhere inside those pages was the truth. About the missing money. About the guardianship. Maybe about who was really pulling the strings. And as the lights flickered with the storm, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the fire. Purpose. There are secrets, I realized, that refuse to stay buried. Some follow you, whispering, waiting for the right moment to be heard. Because not everything meant to rest with the dead stays silent forever. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual. Not because of the weather, but because I knew what I had to do. I placed the leather journal on the table between 2 mugs of untouched coffee and waited. When Michael finally arrived, he looked polished as always. Pressed shirt, sharp cologne, that easy grin he'd learned to wear in every courtroom and dinner party alike. "Morning, Ed," he said, setting his briefcase down. "Laura said you wanted to talk." "Yes," I replied, my voice steady though my pulse wasn't. "I've been doing some reading." I tapped the journal. "Tell me, when you worked at Maple Trust, did you ever come across an old account under the name EM 1985? He blinked too quickly. "EM? No, can't say I have. Why?" "Because," I said, sliding a page toward him, "this account still exists. And someone's been moving money through it recently." Michael leaned back, a chuckle escaping his throat. Too light to be genuine. "Old records, Ed. Probably closed decades ago. You know how messy banks can be." I smiled, though my hands trembled slightly. "Then why are there withdrawals from 3 months ago? Transfers to a trust under your name?" His grin faltered, just for a second. But that second was all it took. "You think I'd steal from you?" he asked, laughing softly, the kind of laugh meant to sound hurt but landing hollow. "After everything this family's been through? You're tired, Ed, you're confused. You should rest." I leaned forward. "I may be old, but confusion doesn't smell like deceit, Michael. It smells like fear." His eyes hardened. "Careful what you're implying." "Careful?" I said, standing. "You took my trust, my name, and you turned them into tools. That's not family. That's accounting with a conscience gone bankrupt." He picked up his briefcase, trying to keep his calm. "This is a misunderstanding. Laura and I only want to make sure you're secure." "Secure?" I echoed. "That's one way to put it. You lock a man in his own life and call it safety." For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked like it was keeping score. When the door finally closed behind him, the silence felt thick but strangely clean. Truth, once spoken aloud, has a way of clearing the air, even if it leaves bruises. I poured out the cold coffee and stared at the leather journal. Every line in that book now looked different. It wasn't just numbers, it was proof, written long before this betrayal began. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere down the road, thunder rolled again. I had spent my life believing family would always be my refuge. But sometimes, refuge becomes the storm. And when the truth starts to leak, it's not the innocent who panic, it's the liars who run first. The courtroom smelled of varnished wood, paper, and quiet judgment. It was the kind of silence that could crush a man before the gavel ever struck. I sat at the defendant's table, though no one called it that. Officially, it was a hearing. But when your own children sit across from you with lawyers in pressed suits, the word family feels more like a bad joke than a comfort. Laura avoided my eyes. Michael, on the other hand, looked like a man auditioning for sainthood. Hands folded, expression soft, the perfect son-in-law who only wanted what's best. I almost admired the performance. Almost. The lawyer began. Smooth voice, rehearsed concern. "Your Honor, Mr. Collins has shown signs of confusion, paranoia, and financial instability. We fear he's no longer able to make sound decisions about his estate." I wanted to laugh, but the sound caught in my throat. Paranoia? It's funny how deceit can make the truth look like madness when the wrong person tells the story. The judge, an older woman with kind but cautious eyes, turned to me. "Mr. Collins, would you like to respond?" I stood, my knees a little stiff but my voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I would." From my jacket pocket, I pulled out a folded letter. Yellowed, creased, the ink faded, but still sharp enough to cut through lies. This was written by my late wife, Margaret. Before she passed, she left me this note. It reads—" I paused, letting the paper tremble just enough in my hand. "If Edward finds this, let him use it to test those who claim to love him." The courtroom fell utterly silent. The hum of the ceiling fan was the only sound left. Laura's eyes widened. Michael's jaw tightened. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Collins," she said carefully, "are you implying a test?" I shook my head slowly. "No, Your Honor. My wife already gave the answers." It wasn't anger in my voice. It was something colder, something truer, a kind of sorrow wrapped in steel. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Outside, through the narrow window, I could see the afternoon sun fading over Denver, painting the city gold. Margaret would have liked that light. She always said it made truth easier to see. The judge cleared her throat. "We'll recess for now. Mr. Collins, I believe there's more to this story than what's been presented." As the room emptied, I caught Laura's gaze for a fleeting second. There was fear there, yes, but also a glimmer of something else. Maybe regret, maybe recognition, or maybe just the uncomfortable weight of a conscience waking up. I folded Margaret's letter back into my pocket. For the first time in months, I felt a strange calm. Justice, I thought, might take its time. But love, real love, never loses its direction. It just waits for us to find our way back. A month can change the shape of a life. The air in Denver felt lighter that spring, as if the city itself had exhaled after holding its breath through all the hearings, whispers, and long nights of waiting. The court had ruled in my favor. I was officially competent, a strange word for something so fragile as trust. Michael disappeared 2 days after the verdict. No calls, no explanations. The papers said he'd taken a consulting job in Texas, but I doubted he'd even made it that far. People like him don't look back. They only calculate how much the past costs them. Laura, on the other hand, showed up one morning at the house on Willow Creek. No makeup, no practiced smile. Just my daughter, pale, tired, holding a cup of coffee she couldn't seem to drink. She stood by the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed in. "Dad," she began, her voice small, "I need to tell you the truth." I gestured for her to sit, the same kitchen table where she'd once done her homework, where Margaret used to braid her hair before school. Funny how furniture remembers what we try to forget. Laura took a deep breath. "Michael owed money, $180,000, some bad investments. He said if I didn't help him get control of your accounts, we'd lose the house. I thought I could fix it before you ever knew." I stared at the steam rising from her untouched coffee. "You almost did," I said softly. "You almost lost everything." Her eyes filled, but she nodded. "I know." Silence lingered between us. Not the heavy kind, but something gentler, like the moment before a storm finally breaks and the air smells new again. I reached across the table, placed my hand over hers. "Laura, the debt's gone. The house is still yours. And me." I smiled faintly. "I'm still here." She let out a shaky laugh that turned into a sob, then back into a laugh again. That's the strange mercy of family. Even after the worst betrayal, somehow, love finds a way to crawl through the cracks. Later that week, I met with an attorney and finalized the papers for the Margaret Collins Foundation. $250,000 a year for students of the arts. Margaret always believed beauty could heal what bitterness breaks. I wanted her name to keep proving that long after I was gone. Some nights I still catch myself talking to her photo on the mantel. I tell her about the scholarships, about Laura's slow return to herself, about how the garden's blooming again. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It simply loosens its grip so you can walk forward without dragging its chains. And as I watched the sun dip behind the Rockies, painting the sky the same soft pink she loved, I whispered, "We made it, Maggie. Somehow, we made it." The cabin sat quietly among the whispering aspens, its windows glazed with early morning light. Edward Collins sat by the window, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. The world outside was silent. just the wind, brushing the leaves like an old memory. On the table lay a worn leather notebook. Beside it, a faded photograph of Margaret smiling in the garden that used to be theirs. And there, tucked inside the notebook, was the envelope, unopened, still sealed with time and hesitation. He ran a finger over the edge of it, wondering if his wife had meant for him to read it at all. After the trial, after Laura's confession, after all the noise had quieted, silence itself had become a kind of companion. Perhaps that was her plan all along, to leave him with enough questions to stay alive, but not enough to stay bitter. He smiled faintly, thinking of how close the world had come to breaking him. The lawyers, the accusations, the betrayals that cut deeper than any wound. Yet here he was, breathing, still capable of kindness. That, he thought, was the truest victory in any family drama. Not the triumph of one side, but the survival of love after the storm. Edward picked up the envelope. It felt lighter than he remembered. For years, he had believed it contained answers, maybe even a revelation that would justify all the pain. Now it simply felt like paper, fragile, unthreatening, harmless. He turned it over once, twice, and then laid it down again. Maybe some truths aren't meant to be read, he whispered, only felt. A soft breeze pushed through the open window, fluttering the curtains like gentle applause. The photo of Margaret slid slightly to the side, revealing a line she had written years ago on the back. "If you ever lose your way, follow the light that forgives." He looked up. The light had shifted, spilling warmth across the wooden floor, touching his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The ache in his chest softened, not erased, but understood. Forgiveness, he realized, was not about forgetting what had happened, but about refusing to let deceit define the rest of his life. Edward stood, opened the window wider, and let the mountain air rush in. He placed the photograph on the sill and watched it catch the sunlight. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet acceptance took root. "Maybe," he murmured, smiling to himself. "Some love letters are meant to stay unopened." He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, as if inhaling the peace Margaret had left behind. Perhaps love finds its power not in justice, but in forgiveness. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so others can watch too. Thank you for being here. Wishing you health, warmth, and a peaceful heart with your loved ones. Don't miss our next video, another story that will stay with you long after it ends.